You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Kleiman.
On today's episode, we're going to be talking about intellectual responsibility on the left and post-truth. We'll be welcoming three guests to talk about their recent calls for the journal Historical Materialism to retract a paper. To hear more episodes of Radio Free Humanity, to read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please visit Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org. You can also make a donation to the podcast there on the website. While our podcast is hosted by MHI, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of MHI.
Hi, this is Andrew with an announcement. I'm going to be participating on the 25th of March in a Zoom panel about the idea of whether socialism as a cooperative, egalitarian, and democratic way of organizing society remains a viable political project. I'm going to be on the panel with other people who contributed, as I did, to the recent special issue of the Journal of Global Fault Lines. There's going to be a lot of panelists, but it will be streamed live at 2 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, which is 2 p.m. in Europe, and that's 10 a.m. On the east coast of the U.S. And if you join by Facebook, you'll be able to see it live. You'll be able to put questions into the chat. The URL of the event is the Facebook group with the following URL: www.facebook.com/groups/envisaging socialism. One word. Hope you'll join us. Thank you.
Today's March 15th, and for this current event section, we're going to be talking about a piece by Daniel Bessner at the New Republic, which is basically a enthusiastic book review of a book by Bruce Kuklick called Fascism Comes to America. And we're also going to be talking about a critique of Bessner's piece by Jonathan Chait in The Intelligencer. The basic gist of this glowing review that Bessner gives is that the entire question about fascism and the world stage today, fascism in America, fascism amongst the Trumpites, is just a bunch of bullshit. Says that basically fascism, the term, is a floating signifier. It is just hyperbole with no real substance behind it. And his basic argument for that is to just list all the ways the people have used fascism over the past 100 years on the right and the left to characterize their enemies. And because so many people have used it to slander enemies on all sides of the political spectrum, that the word really doesn't mean anything. By the end of the piece, he tells us that we shouldn't worry about Trump and the Trumpites because they're no worse than George Bush. That's my short gloss of Bessner's piece. Oh, we should also mention that Bessner is a
frequent contributor to Jacobin, and it's not accidental. Just the other major element of Bessner is the reason we're getting all this renewed talk of fascism is the liberals want us to unite with them against the Trumpites and all of that, and to divert attention from their horrible track record. How's he put it? Overlook liberals' manifold and manifest failures. They're bringing up this phony specter of this phony thing, fascism, so that we bury the hatchet with them and unite against the extreme right. And no, we shouldn't have any part of that. That's what he says.
Yeah, basically this is part of the long-standing Jacobin dilemma that in this era where there really is the rise of fascism in America and a real threat to liberal democracy on the world stage, that most people see the real fight today as the fight against fascism. Maybe they choose to use a different term. Maybe they want to call it democratic backsliding or authoritarianism or illiberal democracy, whatever.
Or the voters say, I don't want these extremist Republicans.
Yeah, whatever they call them, the people who aren't those crazy Trumpites, everyone else realizes that they are a serious existential threat and they are the main problem in society today, except for the Social Democrats, the Jacobites, who still seem to have not gotten the memo, and they really wish that everyone was on their side, exposing the hypocrisies of liberalism.
Yeah, it's branding. It's product differentiation.
Yeah.
The liberals say they're on the left. You say you're on the left.
Yeah.
Well, what legitimates you being in power instead of them?
So let's, one thing we could do with Bessner's brilliant argument, and I say that in quotes, is we could just replace the word fascism with any other polarizing term that people use to criticize their enemies. We could say racism doesn't exist because the people have used accusations of racism to characterize their enemies all over the political spectrum.
Yeah, and Chait points that out, and he says Donald Trump is now using the term racist to mean everybody who's going after him in the courts.
Right.
They're all racist.
So every time the black district attorney is investigating Trump, he calls them a racist, Jonathan Chait points out. So apparently, according to the same logic, then we would say, racism doesn't mean anything. It's a floating signifier. Forget about racism. Let's just worry about universal health care. We could do the same thing with, fake news, right? Trump calls the real news fake news. He's attempt to turn the word into a meaningless floating signifier by just calling whatever he doesn't like fake news. But there really is real news, and there really is fake news in the world. And honest people know the difference, and they don't jettison the term fake news because it's being misused by the fakers. I just don't understand. The whole logic behind it is just bullshit. It's a crappy argument.
I agree it's a crappy argument. And one thing that's interesting, and this is pointed out by a guy named John Gans, and another response to Bessner that Chait links to, is there's been this subtle shift in the denigrators of the term fascism. They began by saying, the MAGA, they're not exactly like Mussolini's brown shirts or Hitler's black shirts, and there's a difference between this and that and the other. They were all super precise in terms of this is what fascism means. And X and Y don't have the features. Now they're just saying the term doesn't mean anything. It can mean whatever you want, so let's forget about it. So I don't know why they've moved, from the original position. I mean, obviously there are people more involved in the debates than we are, but maybe they were getting their asses kicked in terms of trying to deny resemblances.
I mean, we could obviously talk forever about how to define a term like fascism and create these little checkboxes and define right-wing movements by how close they are to historical fascism. But this is kind of a distraction from the real issue, which is whether there is a real threat coming from the far right today.
And the other issue is there a qualitative difference between, let's say, the Republican Party as it exists today and the Republican Party as it existed circa 2001? Has it become more extreme? Has it become more of a threat to our civil liberties and human rights? That's the most amazing thing, is just the refusal of Bessner to realize that things are qualitatively worse, more authoritarian, more of a threat. He even says, Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. There's always been these right-wing vigilantes like Timothy McVeigh, with the bombing of the FBI offices in Oklahoma City. That's just nuts. Everybody knows this stuff has always existed. It's first of all, the fact that they have increased their level of activity and violence. The number of hate crimes is growing year after year, including the most recent year. And as Chait points out, these people are now firmly in the mainstream of the Republican Party, including working for politicians and everything. Things have changed, and he just it's always existed. Yeah, sure.
I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene is one of the top House Republicans, one of the most influential House Republicans. And she
even took the speaker's gavel recently.
This is not the party of George W. Bush, who was obviously a horrible authoritarian monster and a real precursor. I mean, one of the problems I think also that's made here is that you can't use a precursor to a political movement as proof that there has been no change, that there hasn't been a qualitative change. If that was your logic, then history you wouldn't be able to define history at any periods at all, because you'd always be able to say, we had this before. There's always been this, right? But there are times when a quantitative change is such that it becomes a qualitative change in politics. Into this point about like bad readings of history, I realized that Kukulik is, some successful historian, but the way his arguments are presented by Besner, he just does not sound like someone who thinks critically about things. I mean, this argument that fascism hasn't existed in the past in the United States, I think is just a bullshit argument. I mean, the fascist movement before World War II was huge in the United States. I think a lot of historians would see the Ku Klux Klan as a fascist or proto-fascist organization. They had millions of members. They were a mainstream political organization in this country.
And fascism is indigenous to the United States because the Nazis in particular studied the Klan and studied other people of that ilk and borrowed from them. It's not just something from abroad that we're making bad analogies to.
No, I mean, there's been great scholarship of people studying the relationship between the Nazis and American racism. Hitler was a huge admirer of American society. He expected Americans to be behind the Nazis. He was assuming that because racism was so indicative to American society that Americans would jump on the bandwagon and support the Nazi Party. And they based a lot of their laws, the Nuremberg laws, around American immigration policy and concepts of race in American law. So, it's just bullshit to act like it's this imported thing and there was never any really potent fascist element in American politics. I think the more responsible historians are the ones who point out how closely a lot of societies in that period could have been the ones that turned fascist. It wasn't just that there was a disease that just hit Italy and Germany. France could have become fascist. The U.S. could have become fascist. This was a time when a lot of things were possible, and it wasn't predetermined that America was going to be the society that became liberal welfare state. That was not a given thing.
Right. There were really authoritarian tendencies also in the New Deal at FDR. And when C.L.R. James and Freddie Forrest, later known as Raya Dunevskaya, developed the thesis that Russia was state capitalist, James's original piece said that, Stalinist Russia is fascist. So there are obviously distinctions between Stalinism and Hitler's Germany, but people could see the family resemblance. It's a worldwide thing of modern capitalism in a time of crisis.
I think some of these people who are afraid to apply the term today do so because they're really fixated on the particular state form that fascism took in Germany and Italy. And of course, that was often part of the historical definition of fascism was the one-party state with the tight state control of the economy. But maybe in the long run, we might realize that those were just particular historical features that were just part of a lot of states in that period. And that the real substantive aspects of fascism that endure beyond that small historical moment are the rapid reactionary mass base, the use of propaganda, the blending of traditional conservatism and authoritarianism with new ideas about, the creation of a pure society, the way of handling contemporary issues of diversity in national populations as cynical opportunities for political advancement. Maybe these are the more enduring qualities of fascism. Yeah, this blending of lots of different types of reactionary hate into a singular movement. I think racism, anti-immigration, anti-women, anti-trans, homophobic, anti-left. Maybe these are the enduring qualities of fascism, and the particular form the state took is just a passing historical phenomenon.
Yeah, I think things do not have to be identical to say they're of the same type. Nothing is identical with anything else. That's what makes them different things.
Fascism with American characteristics.
The novelist Umberto Eco wrote a really famous piece on fascism, and it was titled Fascism. This was the mid-'90s. He wrote this, and he lived under fascism in Italy. Okay, Mussolini's fascism during the war. And he said, okay, you look around and all the various things that are called fascism, they're all different from one another. And you can't say that there's this one thing that they all have in common. And he said, but just think about what Wittgenstein said about games. We use the term game for a lot of different things, and they have these different uses. The different things we call games, they have family resemblances. This member of the family looks like the other member of the family, looks like the third member of the family, looks like the fourth member of the family, but the first one and the fourth one don't look alike. Okay, it's the same with games, and it's the same with fascism. And he says, okay, here's basically what I think is the primal qualities or the eternal components of fascism. That's what he says in this essay. So this idea that you need a strict laundry list of points and you have to check off every point, that's not how the term is used, but that by itself doesn't turn it into an empty signifier or floating signifier or whatever. And just because people misuse it, very famously Marjorie Taylor Greene and her gazpacho police and all of that, I mean, a lot of people throw around words just for effect, sure. But as you said, and Chait says it, false positives don't mean that there's not a disease there.
We could do the same thing to Besner with the term liberalism.
Oh, yeah. And he really takes a lot of liberty with that one.
I mean, there's a term that has meant so many different things, and people on the left have used it to mean really different things. And what people were calling the liberals in the 50s doesn't look a lot like what people are calling the liberals now.
No, there's been real changes, in the past 30 years as well.
So I guess it's a meaningless term. It's just a floating signifier. And
what about socialism?
Yeah, there you go. There's a term.
I mean, come on, people.
That means completely different things.
What about democratic?
Yeah.
I'm a democratic socialist.
Yeah. The Jacobites call themselves socialists, but their politics resemble FDR, New Deal, liberalism. So, how's that for a bunch of floating bullshit signifiers? So,
one of the things we haven't discussed about that I think is the most important is Besner goes into this whole thing. Okay, since the term fascism is just, BS, it doesn't mean anything. We have to ask ourselves why this term is undergoing a revival and what's the real politics behind this. And it's an attempt of the liberals, the center, to get us to line up behind them and overlook their many failures instead of being a oppositional left. What Besner does not do, as Chait points out, is take that kind of question and turn it on himself and the people who are similarly resistant to talk of fascism in resurgence. Why are they so resistant? What interest does that serve? What are they trying to do by trying to stop us from talking about it? And I think Chait was completely right at the end of his piece. He says that for Besner to acknowledge the danger of the right is, and he quotes Besner, to attract Americans to the centrist cause and in the process help them overlook liberals' manifold and manifest failures. Chait continues, Besner is preoccupied with factional conflict and wishes for liberalism to collapse so that a more radical politics can take its place. And then at the end, Chait says, as Besner puts it, fascism, quote, became a useful foil against which centrist liberals define themselves. Paroxysms of illogic all follow straightforwardly from this directive. That which is useful to centrist liberals must be denied. So Chait doesn't use the term left-first politics, but we use it, and this is what he's saying is this denial that the term fascism has meaning, the attempt to wipe out fascism talk, it's part of the left-first project to promote the interests of, quote, the left in its struggle for power against the liberal left and the mainstream left in the U.S.
Well, that's all the time we have for this segment. Up next, we'll be talking with three guests about our call for the journal Historical Materialism to retract a recent paper. Today's March 10th, and for today's main segment, we actually have a lot of guests who I will introduce shortly. We're going to be talking about a series of open letters that Marxist-Humanist Initiative has just published. All of these letters are calling on the journal Historical Materialism to retract an article. The article is Phenomenology, Scientific Method, and the Transformation Problem. The paper is by Jesse Lopez and Chris Byron. And we actually did a whole segment on the podcast criticizing not just the paper, but also criticizing the journal for publishing the paper in the first place. And we're going to be talking about these letters calling for retraction and discussing, what this is all about on today's podcast. The first thing we should probably make clear is that I don't think any of the authors are calling for a retraction because they disagree with the arguments or positions in the paper. People are not calling for the journal to censor the content that it publishes. But the issues have to do more with academic integrity, commitment to truth on the left. It's very difficult to advance the causes of fighting for freedom, for socialism, when there's not a commitment to truth-telling, when people can just publish blatant misrepresentations and falsehoods in papers, and they can just be accepted in prominent journals like Historical Materialism without any repercussions. So that's sort of the context for these papers. Let me quickly introduce and welcome our guests today. Our guests today are Ralph Keller, who is a recurring guest, Gabriel Donnelly, who was on the podcast several times recently, Seth Morris, who I think is at his first appearance on Radio Free Humanity. So Seth, Ralph, and Gabriel, welcome.
Glad to be back.
Hi, thanks for inviting me.
Hello, everybody.
We had a fourth guest, a fourth author, Vann Seawell, who was going to be on the podcast today, but he couldn't make it. But he pre-recorded a statement. So we're actually going to kick off the discussion with his pre-recorded statement.
My name is Vann Seawell. Unfortunately, due to illness, I will not be able to participate in a roundtable discussion of an episode of Radio Free Humanity involving the publication of an article in the journal Historical Materialism entitled Phenomenology, Scientific Method, and the Transformation Problem by Jesse Lopes and Chris Byron and its attendant issues of truth and editorial accountability. The Lopes and Byron article was recently critiqued by Andrew Kleiman in his article entitled Value, Price, and Prattle, a response to Lopes, Byron, and Historical Materialism, recently published in With Sober Senses, the online publication of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. In his article, Kleiman demonstrated numerous falsehoods, misrepresentations, and errors on the basis of which he requested that the editorial board of Historical Materialism retract the Lopes and Byron article. In reply, Sebastian Budgen, on behalf of the editorial board of Historical Materialism, summarily dismissed Kleiman's retraction request, but doing so without even disputing Kleiman's truth-based arguments for the retraction. Instead, Kleiman was admonished, while Historical Materialism's responsibility for publication of a seriously flawed article was bypassed altogether. In protest of Historical Materialism's actions, several open letters to Historical Materialism were subsequently written and published in With Sober Senses. These open letters stand by themselves and provide additional detail and analysis of this situation. My open letter is among them. However, for my part, as an on-again, off-again subscriber to the journal, I have also decided to cancel my subscription. Make no mistake, this action is not in protest of the high subscription rate or because of some gripe or difference of opinion about choice of topics, articles, or authors. Rather, my subscription cancellation is a mark of how important truth-based scholarship, in particular, and truth-based politics in general, are for understanding the world and what is required to change it. So when the Historical Materialism webpage masthead approvingly cites the adage from Marx's letter to Arnold Ruge regarding, quote, merciless criticism of all that exists, end quote, Historical Materialism is not free from such criticism when its actions are detrimental to the cause of truth and freedom. In conclusion, Radio Free Humanity listeners who want to learn more about the importance of truth should turn to Marxist-Humanist Initiative's Perspectives document, Resisting Trumpist Reaction and Left Accommodation. In particular, Part 4, Combating Post-Truth Politics in Practice and in Theory, available on the Marxist-Humanist Initiative website. Thank you.
Let's jump in and talk about Ralph, your open letter to Historical Materialism. You note in your letter that you're a university teacher and that you're going to discuss with your students the paper that Historical Materialism published. Now, you claim in your open letter that the Lopez Byron paper is full of misrepresentations and falsehoods. If that's the case, why are you planning to discuss it with students?
Yeah, I would like to make my students aware of how to do science and also use that article here, the publication in Historical Materialism, as an example of how not to do science. If we quote an original author, if we use him to advance knowledge, then we must represent him properly. But I don't see this in Lopez and Byron's article. Instead, I see gross misrepresentations and sloppy scholarly conduct, sort of a cavalier attitude towards being diligent in science, try to be as correct as can be. These are my grievances with their article.
Now, we did a whole podcast talking about problems with the Lopez Byron paper, but in case people are not familiar with that episode or they haven't read Andrew's criticism of it or they don't remember from the last episode, I wonder, Ralph, if you could give some examples just to give us some context, because I think it would be easy for people to just think, well, look, these guys are just complaining because they don't like the opinions advanced in the paper. Like when you say sloppy, dishonest, etc., like can you give us some examples?
I have a fact sheet that goes with the open letter, where I have a collection of what Lopez and Byron say in relation to what Marx and what Kleiman in his rebuttal actually say. Probably the most obvious misrepresentation and actually the most egregious misrepresentation of what Marx has actually said is Lopez and Byron on page 230 in their article write, all Marx claims in that section, the section being first page of chapter 3 of capital 1, is that money as a measure of value is the necessary form of appearance of the measure of value which is immanent in commodities, namely labor time. And then Lopez and Byron go on, yet he never states that labor time is also a measure. Now, clearly, in one sentence, or two sentences actually, Lopez and Byron state what Marx actually said and what he allegedly did not say. So really, this struck me as, this should not have been published, actually. This is such bad scholarship.
It comes across as just something that's not well written, like some kind of undergrad poor work when they quote Marx and directly claim that he's saying the opposite of what he's saying. A lot of people misrepresent Marx, and sometimes those misrepresentations are substantive enough that you can have a honest debate about what Marx might have meant about something, right? But this doesn't feel like that. It's just like really obvious kind of bad mistakes. It feels really unprofessional. That's what I think is so embarrassing for historical materialism about this paper, is just how poor the mistakes are. It's like very low quality work. I don't know about you all, but I feel less upset at Lopez and Byron than I do at the journal. I mean, the journals need to function as some kind of arbiter of what is like quality work and what isn't quality work. You can't just publish like any sloppy thing that you get presented with just because you happen to like the positions of the writers. You have to have some kind of standards, or else you're just functioning like a social media platform where anyone can publish anything. I mean, I guess we'll get to that in a bit. But let's talk to Gabriel Donnelly next. You've discussed the paper and historical materialism's refusal to retract the paper with other people, friends, acquaintances. What was your reaction when you discovered what was in the paper and when you learned that the journal is refusing to retract it? And how do people react to that?
I was very struck by all of the features that you and Ralph were just pointing out, and the fact that, as you were just saying, a journal is supposed to be a gatekeeper and some indicator of quality. And by publishing this and putting a stamp of approval on this, they're in some way trying to launder this really, really shoddy work. And the only reasonable response to Kleinman's absolute accurate dismantling in the two pieces now that have been published in With Sober Senses of Lopez and Byron's paper is its retraction. I think it's been completely shown to be, as you've said, undergraduate shoddy work. And yet, historical materialism has not just refused to retract it, they've requested, their only concession has been to suggest that Kleinman's dismantling be put alongside it, as if they are of equal merit and in dialogue with each other. And in conversations with acquaintances, I guess fellow travelers, I spoke with everyone I spoke with, 4 people. Their understanding of having read either both papers in their entirety or one in its entirety, and some of the other was exactly what we've said. The Lopez and Byron article is a piece of shoddy work, shouldn't have been published. But I was really struck by the fact that at least 2 of them says to me, well, I don't understand the need to call for retraction, though. I mean, this was a really striking word choice, I thought. Isn't it dramatic to ask for that? I mean, why not just write another rebuttal again? And I really hope the listeners listening sit up and hear this part, because for me, in my writing of my open letter and getting involved with writing open letters on this, I hope that this causes other people to sit up and listen and pay attention and stand up for truth in left spaces. We cannot just continue having ceaseless back and forth dialogues that go nowhere. We cannot continue having this debate for debate's sake, where we allow one side or the other of any debate to say nonsense just to continue a dialogue, just for content, just for clicks, and just to feel like we're engaging in salon talk. When we talk about Marx, we're supposed to be committed to a philosophy and theory of liberation. And instead, we treat these ideas as trivial and as worthy of this shoddy work. So I wrote my letter and spoke to people trying to stand up for truth, to really stand up for not just talking BS back and forth, but actually arriving at real conclusions.
It feels to me kind of like I can only assume that the people wanted to publish this paper and the journal because they liked the fact that it was criticizing the TSSI. But that they didn't really have like any concern for how well it did a job of criticizing the TSSI. And that kind of thinking is one where you're not trying to defeat an opponent by actually addressing arguments, doing the real work of theory and debate, of advancing argumentation by honing your arguments and responding honestly to criticism. Is just an attempt to win arguments by wearing down your opponent, by like throwing as much shit at the wall as you can to see what sticks, to wear your opponent down because they have to constantly defend themselves against ridiculous misrepresentations. You know, Andrew had to spend all this time like going through the whole paper and critiquing and responding to all this nonsense. And now we were talking about it on 2 different podcasts, right? But it's a total waste of time in the sense that like we could be having substantive conversations about issues that have come up, and this is not happening. Instead, it's like we're having a substantive conversation again, just about like ethics on the left and ethics amongst like the gatekeepers on the left.
I'm struck by, in your description of that, how much, and you alluded to this, I think, before, how much that model, as much as I think you totally accurately described it, of just being a methodology of winning an argument by wearing down, is also, you know, how you survive on social media clicks. You just constantly need to be churning things out, regardless of quality. It's all about engagement and content not in a sense of merit, but you know what I mean, content as in putting stuff out there for the algorithm. It's a very similar approach that many broader too than just historical materialism. Many people are on the left just churning stuff out. The second thing I wanted to say was, you were also reminding me of a comparison I made in my open letter. I compared this sort of BS continuing of a dialogue that is not a dialogue. You know, we can host your article on historical materialism, but we won't consider a retraction, even though we're not in any way going to refute all the reasons with merit that you pointed to for why it should be retracted, to the creationists and how the creationists used to debate. When I was growing up in the Bush 2 years, the creationist, what was his name? The Gish Gallup an argumentation method of the creationists to just throw things at any poor sap, evolutionary professor that would be hauled out to debate them in front of a crowd. No matter how badly they had done on the last point, they would just go to the next thing and just throw. And like you said, just to wear down the argument. And the reason I invoked the creationists in my open letters, for me, they're the ultimate bad faith debaters or people engaging in discourse. And this, to me, reeks of just bad faith and bad behavior and ethical truth-seeking.
Well, let's bring in Seth Morris. We haven't heard from you yet, Seth. You note in your open letter, you say that you have, quote, some familiarity with the TSSI, the temporal single system interpretation of Marx's value theory, and some of the dead philosophers quoted in the paper, close quote. You've read the paper pretty carefully, so can you give us some details about what you find wrong with it and what you think is serious enough to warrant calling for a retraction?
It can maybe get confusing just considering how much is wrong with this paper. It could seem like just the critique never ends. And I think in order to not get lost in evaluating the paper, the quote brought by Andrew and Ralph and me in my letter, the quote about labor time being the imminent measure of value in Marx, direct Marx quote, and then the author saying, but Marx never says labor time is a measure of value. That is obvious, and that completely makes their thesis into nonsense. But it's not like the rest of the paper can be saved if that's corrected. Like from the very beginning, the paper is supposed to be about the transformation problem, but couched in a discussion about phenomenology and scientific method. The phenomenology refers to Husserl, who is mentioned on the first page in a footnote, and on the last page, none of his writings are cited in the bibliography. There's not much to say about the relation of Husserl to this, in my opinion, unfortunately. It might be interesting. It seems like a big ask to try to talk about Marx and Husserl as different as they are in the same paper. But in my opinion, the only way to make sense of what's going on here is to say that what the authors are presenting is not a sensible interpretation of Marx or a representation of Husserlian phenomenology. It is their phenomenology or their abstract theory of Marx's capital. And the first part of the paper before the contending theories section is just extremely weak argumentation. You're given a caricature of Husserl, He's kind of not really there at all. You're told that Aristotle is a vulgar empiricist and opposed to Galilean science, which really, according to authors, is just their idea of phenomenology and bracketing of sense appearances. And this is all very confusing, but I'm trying my best to accurately relay what the paper is saying. And then with this extremely weak, nonsensical argument about how to interpret Marx's capital, we get to a contending theories section where, as these old dead philosophers have been caricatured for the purposes of this weak argument, now the temporal single system theory is brought up and blatantly lied about. I mean, that seems extreme. I don't know the intentions behind it, but if you take the citations of Reclaiming Marx's Capital, look at the argument, look at the references in Marx that the TSSI as an interpretation is trying to reckon with critically. Lopez and Byron will claim that, won't believe your eyes, that value has nothing to do with quantity in mathematics, and yet Marx is quantifying value all over the place. And it's really difficult for me to account for how this happens, how this all just kind of came a paper or an argument or an attempted argument. But something, being familiar with the TSSI, that I find especially baffling and frustrating about this is Marx is not easy to approach for a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. It's a vague statement, but it's always been important for me to determine whether Marx was right or not in what he was talking about, not what Marx should have meant, or reading between the lines of extremely desperate quotes what I want Marx to have meant. But the TSSI is a very honest and critical example of how to scientifically evaluate the consistency of Marx's theory, his value theory specifically, and is very upfront about its intentions, the primary sources, and the way it handles Marx's Capital, as well as call them contending theories, like the dual system theory or the simultaneous single system theory. And in the TSSI, there's a level of clarity that leaves it open to scientific discourse and critique in scientific terms, not arbitrary terms. But as we all on this call know very well, responses to the TSSI don't really meet it on the level of scientific critique. They do something else.
Hey, we're going to return to this conversation in just a moment, but first, as we do in every episode, we're going to take just a few minutes to hear from Andrew Clark, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which sponsors this podcast.
Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and today's many other social, political, and economic crises make this a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. In the U.S., we are faced with the threat of Trumpism triumphing and all-out authoritarianism extinguishing our right to carry on these discussions. Yet at the same moment, the multiracial movement for Black lives has spread to every corner of the country and the world, launching a flood of activism and new ideas that deepen the concept of freedom. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses in which we do not merely assert but demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value, close quote. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not to socialism. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses who will form their own organization and whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Our ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, women, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. To this end, we open our website to the widest possible dialogue with people around the world. We intend to practice as well as espouse a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice, and as the way to assure the survival of Marxist humanism. Please join us.
So Andrew Kleinman wrote this request for Historical Materialism to retract the paper. It's up on the MHI website, and someone named Peter Green, who I think is someone who's been in the orbit associated with the journal for a long time, wrote a comment on that paper, and he wrote, quote, "The editors of Historical Materialism, especially Sebastian Budgen, do not take sides in these debates, in accord with their principles as outlined right at the beginning of their project. They provide a forum in which all sorts of stuff gets published," close quote. Now, I think probably we all recognize the value of journals not taking sides among different points of view and allowing different opinions to be expressed. But is it appropriate for a scholarly journal, which is what Historical Materialism purports to be, right? A scholarly journal. Is it appropriate for them to not take sides in favor of truth rather than falsehood, correct rather than incorrect representations of people's arguments, and so forth?
This isn't a completely isolated incident. It's not that papers have never been retracted before. And I think it's not a very interesting topic for most people. I honestly haven't thought about it too much, except in respect to famous events like the Sokol Hoax, where a academic scientist published a fraudulent paper in a social science journal that was just basically bullshit. It was intentionally bullshit to just test the editorial practices of this particular journal, and that caused a scandal. I think maybe somewhat connected, maybe less famous of an event is the Bogdanov affair, where the Bogdanov brothers wrote a very bad physics paper that was published in a peer-reviewed theoretical physics journal. But the difference is they weren't trying to pull off a hoax. I mean, they may have been, their intentions aren't really my concern, but they weren't trying to pull one over on the journal that was publishing them. I mean, in Marxism, in philosophy, there's a history of aversion from the outside to taking philosophy seriously or Marxism because of reputations that they have, misrepresentations mostly. To have a self-described peer-reviewed critical Marxist journal publish just anything, regardless of whether it has any relation to truth or materials it discusses, is really discouraging, I think, to people who might be interested in Marxist scholarship.
In one way or another, all of these letters and this discussion raised the issue of post-truth, which is something we discuss a lot on the podcast. MHI has argued for many years that the fight against post-truth politics needs to be an integral part of the fight against Trumpism and the far right. And we've also done a lot of critiquing of parts of the left for ways they've adopted elements of the post-truth moment as well. I'm thinking, for instance, a lot of this conversation reminds me of the criticism that we discussed not that long ago on the podcast of John Bellamy Foster's perversion of Marx, his creation of this ecological Marxism based on metabolic rift. He's created this whole non-existent theory in Marx and supports it with completely BS citations where he just chops up Marx quotes and makes him say whatever he wants. And this gets published by Monthly Review, and people treat it like it's honest scholarship, and it's just total nonsense. There's no integrity to it at all academically. But anyway, back to this paper. I'd like to know what you think are the political implications of historical materialism publicizing this paper. What are the implications of its refusal to retract the paper? What are the implications of this both-sidist editorial policies they claim to have, where they don't take sides? Is it just like an innocent mistake, like they just don't have high standards and they kind of let anything they want in the paper? Or is there something like intentional about it? Are they wielding their sloppy editing for a political purpose? And what are the consequences? Is this helping the left? I assume we would all agree this is detrimental to the left, but maybe we can discuss that more.
I'd like to think that this is just sloppiness and maybe an innocent mistake, but I cannot in good conscience think that, because the implications are far too great. The guiding principle in any debate should be, is what is being said demonstrably correct, or can it be demonstrated that it is correct, or on the other hand, can it be demonstrated that what was said is demonstrably false? So from that perspective, we cannot treat an argument like an opinion. An opinion on something, what is the value of it if everybody is right? So there needs to be this guiding principle. Is it demonstrably correct, or can it be demonstrably false? That's the first thing. The second thing, in terms of the political implications, historical materialism is just sending the wrong signals. What was said earlier was that in the left debate, we cannot afford going back and forth without a measure of, should we take this seriously or should we not take this seriously? We cannot take everything and anything that is said seriously and weigh it and go back and forth. That takes us nowhere, and it does not help us to take on the enemy. And the enemy is capital, and with capital comes unfreedom. So to summarize it, the implications here of not retracting the paper, they are far too great. The left project is far too important to let this problem slide. The historical materialism are not the only ones who do it, but in terms of the standing they have, they are meant to be a scholarly journal within the left. No, they must retract it. There is no other option.
The political implications of this relate back to what I've said again and again, that this is ultimately politics as content creation and discussion of liberatory philosophy as salon talk. They believe that you can have a your Marx or my Marx and not actually have a real understanding of the text and whether or not Marx is right or wrong or something, and what we need to know to improve our lives and to liberate humanity, right? But it's instead is you can have your interpretation, I can have mine, and we can keep selling our articles and selling our books and keep going and speaking at events. And there's no real getting to the bottom of anything. There's nothing productive happening. That's the political valiance of it, really. The business of being a left entertainer and a left content maker. We've all done it, providing a slop to feel like we're doing political thinking when we're consuming stuff, when we're not. And you need to stop accepting BS and start getting to the bottom of things and doing serious thinking and not having your interpretation, my interpretation, but having truth.
I think these are really important points that Gabriel raises here, the lack of principles. If we cannot hold on to principles, or if we cannot, as the left, if we cannot stand on principles, then we have no hope of attracting people to our project. Because, as Gabriel says, they will see through the bullshit. Yeah? And then, if that happens, they will ask, what do you have to offer? Nothing. So this is for me, the essence of where self-serving attitudes, poor scholarship, amateurish way of writing papers, where this leads to for the left.
I'd like to interject with something. I think it's more nefarious than that. Back in the 1930s and 40s, the Trotskyists always used to say about the Stalinists, in the United States, that the Communist Party and so forth, well, they don't educate their members because their members would say stupid stuff and all of that. And C.L.R. James, who I'm not the biggest fan of in many respects, but he wrote something absolutely stellar. And he said, this is wrong. The Stalinists educate their members very well for what the Stalinists want from them. And they want from them that malleability, that flexibility to turn on a dime when the line's been changed, to change with it. In other words, it's not that everybody is going to be turned off. People of principle will be turned off. But, what's going to be left? Who is the left going to attract? It's going to be attracting people without principle. And people without principle are therefore attracting other unprincipled people. In other words, in terms of what they want, I don't think that they're failing. It's not that they're getting nobody, they're getting their kind of people to do their kind of stuff. This is my own opinion, in any case.
Yeah, I was actually going to say something somewhat similar to that. I think you probably said it better, Andrew, but that people might be attracted to this who are interested in doing theory for advancing their own agenda, or people that see theory as a way to wield power over other people, to see theory as like a type of propaganda to be used for like the politics of power and destroying people, rather than seeing it as a collective project of advancing truth. So it might seem innocuous when the left is not in power and marginalized in society, but we have to think about what kind of left we want to have for in the future, when maybe the left actually has more influence in society. And we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the 20th century. We don't want theory to just be a little dressing on top of like a Stalinist power politics. And also just this weird way, that Marx is like appealed to as an authority that like ends all debate. But then what ends up happening is that you just make Marx say whatever you want to say so that you can get the last word in. It's just ridiculous. And that's been going on for a long time. So Historical Materialism has refused to retract the paper, and they've basically just ignored the issue of the criticism that there's a lot of inaccuracies in the article. And they tried to pose the whole thing as just an issue of people in MHI not liking the conclusions of the article. And the same thing with Peter Green's comments on the website. He's just avoided the whole issue of like inaccuracy, misrepresentation, instead just try to make it a matter of people not liking opinions. So why do you think historical materialism and people who collaborate with it seem so reluctant to address this issue of accuracy versus inaccuracy?
I think at some level, it has to do with the way they work. They're driven by their careers. So the lack of principle is an expression that they're driven by careerist thinking. They want to get as much published, as many papers in as they can. Truth is the first casualty. When then somebody like Andrew Kleiman comes along and rips their points apart, they haven't got anything left in the tank. They cannot intellectually engage with Andrew. They can't address Andrew's argument. And to me, this is a sort of a subtle confession that they lost the argument at the intellectual level. So the only thing they have left is to do what Green do, is to do what Budgeon do, to completely avoid the issue and accuse us of our feelings have been hurt. That's what I think. I think it plays a large part in. It's a large part to the answer to the question.
Seth, in your open letter, you have at the end 3 examples. And in your first example, you're referring to Lopez and Byron citing Chapter 7 of Volume 1 of Capital and saying, well, we looked in Chapter 7 and this idea of a monetary expression of labor time has no basis in Marx's work. So it's not like quoting is something that's there. It's like saying, well, it's just not there. Can you comment on that?
I give some examples of really egregious misrepresentations of the TSSI specifically in my open letter. And the first example is maybe worth going into because it kind of clarifies what is and isn't appropriate for interpretation of Capital, in my view. And the authors, Lopez and Byron, say that the monetary expression of labor time has no basis in Marx's work. And Marx did not use an abbreviation, MELT, but he pretty much uses those words in the section of Capital that Lopez and Byron cite as evidence that the monetary expression of labor time has no basis in Marx's work. Marx literally says, expressed in gold, the labor of 5 days is 30 shillings. You know, you can write that different ways as the monetary expression, but it is literally the expression of 5 days worth of labor, 12 hours a day, expressed in gold. And that amount, that quantity, which shouldn't exist by Lopez and Byron's arguments, is 30 shillings, which is a money amount.
That's all that needs to be said about that.
Yeah, I have this very point as an example in my fact sheet. Lopez and Byron on page 232 write something like, or the quote is, if Marx frequently used such a conversion factor as melt, why is it only one inaccurate citation provided by Kleiman? So Andrew addresses this in his rebuttal. He has a quote there from Marx, say that 100 pounds provides the wages of 100 workers for 1 week. If these 100 workers perform as much surplus labor as necessary labor, they work as much time for the capitalist each day for the production of surplus value as they do for themselves, for the production of their wages. And their total value product would then be 200 pounds. The surplus value they produce amounting to 100 pounds. So here is another example where Lopez and Byron's claim is demonstrably false.
I would add on to that I think this problem with their reasoning about value and whether it's quantifiable or not, or perceptible or bracketed or all these things is really obfuscating and distorting what Marx is trying to do in Capital in the first place, which, you know, not easily summarized, but in terms of value and surplus value, the investigation of surplus value is tremendously important for Capital and Marx's critique of political economy. How do you account for that if value is just this abstract thing that you maybe can perceive, maybe can't perceive, but you can't count it. It all just falls apart, and it kind of makes Marx seem like an obsessive delusion. I don't know, a ranter, if he's going to write so much about such a simple and nonsensical argument.
Thank you all for being on the podcast today. This has been a great conversation, and I urge everyone to read your papers, to leave some comments, to engage with us on this issue. If you agree, you can write to Historical Materialism as well and urge them to retract the Lopez-Byron paper. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you
very much. It was a great conversation.
Hey, that's all the time we have for this episode of Radio Free Humanity. If you like the podcast, please do stop by Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org to listen to other episodes and to read more about these issues and others. As always, if you like the podcast, we encourage you to write to us, to comment and rate the podcast, and of course to share with all your friends and enemies.